Part 1. When the sky turned strange. The land remembered everything. Yurri knew this as surely as she knew the patterns of stars that wheeled overhead each night, as surely as she could read the whispers of wind through eucalyptus leaves. The land held songs older than memory itself, songlines that her people had walked for 40,000 years, threading the continent together with stories, law, and kinship. She was 17 summers old, a woman of the Eora people, and she could trace her lineage back through countless generations to the Dreamtime itself. It was the season of Parramatta, late spring by the reckoning that would come later, in the year that white men would record as 1788. Yurri stood on the sandstone cliffs overlooking what her people called Warrain, the great harbor whose waters shifted from deep blue to turquoise depending on the sun's mood. Her feet were bare against stone that still held warmth from the day, and her dark hair, thick and strong, lifted slightly in the evening breeze coming off the water. She was not alone in her vigil. Beside her, maintaining the careful distance that unmarried young people were expected to keep, stood Marrung. He was perhaps 2 years older, a hunter whose skill with the spear had already earned him respect among the men. His shoulders were broad from years of throwing, his movements carrying that particular grace that came from a lifetime of reading the land's subtlest signs. The traditional scars on his chest, the marks of his initiation, still showed fresh against his skin, testament to his recent passage into manhood. They had come to this place because something was wrong. For 3 days now, the elders had been troubled. Smoke signals from clans to the north had carried strange warnings. Fishing parties reported seeing something unprecedented on the horizon, great white shapes, like clouds but solid, moving across the water with impossible slowness. Some said these shapes had the wings of giant birds. Others claimed they were floating islands. Yurri's grandmother, old Marrung, one of the senior women who held the sacred knowledge of their people, had been performing divination rites, reading patterns in smoke and consulting the ancestral spirits. The omens, she said, were confused, either entirely evil nor good, but certainly momentous. Change was coming, the kind of change that would echo through the songlines themselves. There, Marrung said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of a hunter who has spotted prey. Yurri followed his gaze. Far out on the harbor, perhaps 2 miles distant, shapes were indeed materializing through the afternoon haze. But these were no clouds, no islands. They were vessels, enormous beyond comprehension, with great sheets of pale fabric billowing from tall wooden trunks that rose impossibly high into the air. Ships. Though Yurri had no word for them yet, had never conceived of such things existing, some deep instinct told her these were craft made by human hands. But what humans could create something so vast? And why had they come? The ancestor spirits are restless, Yurri whispered, feeling the truth of it in her bones. Around them, the evening birds had fallen silent. Even the ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath. Marrung's hand moved unconsciously to the spear he carried, though what use such a weapon might be against those floating giants, neither of them could imagine. His jaw was set, his eyes narrowing with the focus he normally reserved for tracking kangaroo through the bush. "We must tell the elders," he said. "Bennelong should know. Colby. All of them." Bennelong was a young man of perhaps 25 summers, already marked as somewhat of significance among the Eora. He was clever, charismatic, a warrior and a thinker whose opinions carried weight in the councils. Colby, his friend and fellow warrior, was equally respected. If anyone would know how to interpret these strange arrivals, it would be them. But Yurri found herself frozen, unable to look away from those approaching ships. Now that they were closer, she could make out details that made her stomach clench with an emotion she couldn't name, not quite fear, but something more complex. Anticipation. Dread. Wonder. The vessels were painted in colors her people used: red ochre, black charcoal, white clay, but the shapes were all wrong, angular and precise in a way that nature never was. They moved with purpose against the wind, which should have been impossible. And on their decks, she could now see tiny figures moving about. People. Strangers. Beings from beyond the known world. "Marrung," she said softly, and something in her voice made him turn from his surveillance of the ships to look at her instead. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Yurri felt the weight of all the unspoken things between them. Their families had been discussing a marriage arrangement. It was expected, even desired by both of them, though they had never spoken of it directly to each other. That would have been improper. Yuri's mother had already begun teaching her the specific songs and knowledge she would need as a wife, the sacred women's business that connected her to the land and to the cycles of life. Marrung had been working to prove himself as a provider, bringing back larger kills, demonstrating his value to her family. But suddenly, watching those ships approach, Yurri felt as though the future they had both been moving toward, the future that had seemed as certain as the rising sun, had become uncertain, shimmering like a mirage in the heat. "Whatever comes," Marrung said, and his voice held a gentleness he rarely displayed, "we face it together. You and I. Our people." It was as close as he had ever come to speaking of what lay between them. Yurri felt warmth spread through her chest despite the growing chill of evening. She wanted to reach for his hand, to feel the solid reality of his calloused palm against hers, but she maintained the proper distance. There would be time for touching after marriage, after ceremony. They would dance the traditional dances, exchange the gifts, join their families as had been done for countless generations. At least, that was what she had always believed. The ships were drawing closer now, and Yurri could hear something, a strange creaking sound, like trees in a storm but more rhythmic, more purposeful. And voices faint across the water, speaking in sounds that were clearly language but utterly incomprehensible. "We should go," Marrung said again, more urgently now. "Before dark." He was right. The path down from the cliffs was treacherous even in daylight, and their camp was perhaps an hour's walk through the bush. But Yurri lingered one moment more, watching those ships, trying to burn this image into her memory. Somehow, she knew this was a threshold moment, a before and after that would divide her life, divide all their lives, into what came before and what would come after. The land remembered everything, yes. But did the land know how to remember this? They turned together and began the descent, their feet finding the familiar handholds and paths worn smooth by countless generations of their people. As they walked, Yurri became aware of the forest around them with an intensity she had never quite felt before. The paperbarks with their peeling white skin. The banksias with their strange flower spikes. The calls of the lorikeets settling into the trees for the night, flashes of rainbow color against green leaves. This was her country, the land she had been born to, the land that had birthed her ancestors since time beyond counting. Every tree, every rock, every water source had a story, a song, a meaning in the great web of law that connected all things. Would these strangers understand that? Could they? By the time they reached the camp, twilight had settled over the land like a blanket. Cook fires were already burning, sending columns of smoke up through the trees. The camp was larger than usual. Perhaps 70 or 80 people gathered together from several clan groups. Word of the strange ships had spread quickly, and people had come together for protection, for counsel, for the comfort of numbers. Yurri could see old Marrung sitting beside one of the larger fires, surrounded by other senior women. Her grandmother's face was deeply lined, her white hair braided with shells and feathers. She was speaking in the low, urgent tones that meant important business was being discussed. Bennelong was there too, standing tall and straight, his muscular frame silhouetted against the firelight. Beside him, Colby gestured animatedly, while a circle of men listened with grave expressions. They were debating, Yurri could tell from the patterns of speech, the formal protocols being observed, trying to decide how to respond to these arrivals. "You've seen them?" Bennelong called out as Marrung and Yurri approached. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Yes," Marrung replied, moving into the circle of men while Yurri, following proper custom, went to join the women. "They are closer now. Perhaps they will make landfall with tomorrow's tide." A murmur ran through the gathering. Fear, yes, but also curiosity. The Eora were a people who had faced many challenges, storms, droughts, conflicts with neighboring groups, and they had always adapted, survived, preserved their law and their culture. But this was different, and everyone knew it. Yurri sank down beside her grandmother, feeling the older woman's hand find hers in the darkness. Old Marrung's grip was still strong despite her age, her fingers rough from a lifetime of work. "You saw them with your own eyes, child?" her grandmother asked quietly. "Yes, grandmother." "And what did your spirit tell you?" This was an important question. The Eora believed that each person had a connection to the spirit world, a sixth sense that could perceive things beyond the physical. Yurri closed her eyes, reaching inward for that deep knowing. "Change," she said finally. "Great change. Like when a bushfire comes, and everything must be remade." Old Marrung nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she already suspected. "The Dreamtime stories speak of such times," she said. "Times when the world shifts, when new things are born and old things pass away. But the law remains, child. Remember that. Whatever comes, the law remains. The law, the complex system of beliefs, practices, and obligations that governed every aspect of their lives, that connected them to the land and to each other, that had sustained their people for millennia. Could any force, even these strange visitors, truly change that?" Across the fire, Yurri caught Marrung's eye. He was listening to Bennelong speak, but his attention was divided, his gaze finding hers repeatedly in the firelight. In his face she saw the same questions that plagued her own heart. What would tomorrow bring? What would these strangers want? Would there be violence or friendship? Understanding or conflict? And through it all, running like an underground river beneath her other concerns, was a more personal question. Would she and Marrung have the future they had been promised? Would there be time for their marriage, for the life they had both imagined? The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched over countless generations of her people. Somewhere out on the harbor, those great ships rocked gently at anchor, filled with men who knew nothing of songlines or dreamtime, of law or sacred obligation. Two worlds were about to collide, and Yurri and Marrung stood at the threshold, young and in love and utterly unprepared for what was to come. The land remembered everything. Soon, it would have new memories to hold, memories of meetings and misunderstandings, of wonder and tragedy, of love tested in ways no one could yet imagine. But that was tomorrow's story. Tonight, there was only the fire, and the stars, and the ancient songs that bound them all together. Part 2. The Meeting of Worlds. Dawn came to Warrain Harbor with the soft, golden light that had greeted countless mornings before, but this dawn was different. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, thick with the weight of history about to unfold. Yurri had barely slept. She had lain on her sleeping mat of woven grass, wrapped in her possum skin cloak, listening to the night sounds of the bush, the cry of the mopoke owl, the rustle of possums in the trees, the distant boom of the ocean against cliffs, and thinking about those ships. In her restless half-sleep, she had dreamed of white birds with enormous wings, of voices speaking in tongues that shifted and changed like water, of Marrung reaching for her across a distance that kept growing wider no matter how they tried to close it. She rose before most of the camp, joining other early risers at the stream to drink and wash. The water was cool and clear, running over smooth stones worn by millennia of flow. She cupped her hands and brought the water to her face, trying to wash away the lingering unease of her dreams. When she returned to camp, she found it already stirring with unusual energy. Bennelong was organizing a party to go down to the harbor's edge. They would go in peace, he declared, carrying no weapons beyond what was normal for daily life. They would observe these strangers, try to communicate, determine their intentions. But we go prepared, Colby added, his hand resting on the carved fighting club at his belt. Peace does not mean foolishness. The Council of Elders had debated long into the night. Some argued for avoiding contact entirely, let the strangers leave on their own, as other occasional visitors had done over the generations. But Bennelong had prevailed with a different argument. These ships were too large, too purposeful. These people had not come by accident, and they would not leave quickly. Better to meet them now, on terms of strength and dignity, than to wait and be found unprepared. Yurri watched as her grandmother approached Bennelong, placing a gnarled hand on his shoulder. "You carry all our voices with you," old Burong said formally, using the ritual language of important occasions. "You speak for the land, for the ancestors, for all the generations yet to come. Walk carefully, Bennelong. Walk with wisdom." He nodded gravely, accepting the weight of responsibility. At 25, he was young for such a role, but there was something about him, a natural authority, a quickness of mind, a courage that did not come from ignorance but from genuine strength, that made people trust him. "I would come too," Marrung said, stepping forward from the group of younger men. "If you will have me." Bennelong studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You have good eyes and a steady heart." "Yes." "Come." Yurri felt her stomach tighten. She wanted to protest, to keep Marrung safe in the camp, but she knew such a reaction would shame them both. Warriors face danger. That was their purpose, their honor. Instead, she caught his eye and gave a small nod of pride and approval. What she didn't expect was for her grandmother to turn to her next. "And you will come as well, granddaughter," old Marrung said quietly. "Me?" Yurri's surprise was genuine. "But grandmother, this is men's business." "No." The old woman's voice was firm. "This is everyone's business. These strangers will have women among them, or if they don't, they will need to know that our women exist, that we are not merely shadows behind our men. You are young, you are quick to learn, and your spirit is strong. You will come and you will observe everything. Everything. And you will remember it all to tell the other women what you have seen." It was not a request but a command, backed by all the authority of old Marrung's position as a keeper of women's sacred knowledge. Yurri bowed her head in acceptance, her heart now racing for entirely different reasons. The party that set out as the sun cleared the trees numbered perhaps 30 people, men and women both, though more men than women. They carried digging sticks and fishing spears, tools of daily life that could serve as weapons if needed but did not declare hostile intent. Several of the senior men bore the ceremonial scars and decorations that marked their status, their bodies painted with white clay and red ochre in patterns that announced their clan affiliations and totems. Yurri walked with the other women, but she noticed that Marrung kept drifting closer to her position in the group, maintaining the appearance of propriety while still staying near. Once their eyes met, and she saw in his face the same mixture of fear and excitement that churned in her own belly. The path to the harbor took them through country that Yurri knew intimately. Here was the rock pool where she had learned to swim as a child. There was the grove of fig trees where the women gathered fruit each autumn. Past that ridge was the sacred site where initiations were held, where Marrung himself had endured the trials that made him a man just seasons ago. Every step of this land held meaning, held memory, held law. And now they were walking it toward an encounter that might change everything. As they crested the final rise before the harbor beach, the ships came into full view, and Yurri heard several people gasp. In the full light of morning, the vessels were even more impressive, and more unsettling, than they had been at dusk. There were 11 of them now, she counted, ranging from massive ships that dwarfed anything she could have imagined, down to smaller boats that still outsized any watercraft her people made. And there were people, hundreds of people, moving about on the decks and beaches like ants on a disturbed nest. Bennelong raised his hand, and the group halted. They stood in the shade of the eucalyptus trees, observing. The strangers were setting up some kind of camp on the beach at the place the Eora called Warrain, near the fresh water stream that fed into the harbor. They were dragging strange objects off their boats, wooden boxes, cloth bundles, things Yurri had no names for. And the people themselves. They were pale. Not the warm brown of her people, but a strange pinkish-white color, like the belly of a fish. They wore elaborate coverings over their entire bodies, not simple cloaks or aprons but complex wrappings of cloth in various colors, most notably red and blue. Some wore strange hard shells on their heads that gleamed in the sunlight. "They are burning in the sun," one of the women murmured, and Yurri realized it was true. The exposed skin of the strangers was turning an angry red color. How could people survive with such vulnerable skin? "Perhaps they come from a land where the sun does not shine," another woman suggested. "A cold place, a dark place." Marrung was studying them with a hunter's eye. "They move strangely," he observed quietly to Bennelong. "Clumsy." Like they don't know the ground beneath their feet. It was true. The strangers stumbled over rocks and roots that any Eora child would have navigated without thought. They seemed disconnected from the land, separate from it in a way that was deeply unnatural to Yurri's way of thinking. But what struck her most forcefully was the sheer number of them. She tried to count but lost track past 200. There were more strangers on this beach than there were people in her entire clan, possibly more than several clans combined. We should make our presence known, Bennelong decided. We will approach slowly, with openness. Colby, stay close. Marrung, watch the tree line. If this goes badly, the women retreat first. Yurri felt her grandmother's hand briefly squeeze her shoulder, a gesture of both comfort and warning. Then Bennelong stepped out from the trees and onto the open ground, and the moment of contact began. The strangers noticed immediately. Yurri saw one of them point, then shout something in that incomprehensible tongue. Others turned, and suddenly there was a flurry of activity among them. Some reached for long sticks they carried, weapons, Yurri realized, though of a design she didn't understand. Others seemed to be calling out, organizing themselves. Then one figure stepped forward from the group of strangers. He was clearly a leader of some kind. Other men deferred to him, stepping back to make way. He was perhaps 40 years old by Yuri's estimation, with hair going gray at the temples. Unlike many of the others, his skin had a weathered, sun-darkened quality that suggested he was more accustomed to the outdoors. He wore particularly elaborate clothing, with gold decorations that caught the light. This was Captain Arthur Phillip, commander of the First Fleet, though of course Yurri had no way of knowing that. All she knew was that he carried himself with the bearing of someone used to authority. And when he raised his hand in what seemed to be a gesture of peace, the other strangers quieted. Bennelong matched the gesture, raising his own hand. Then he began to walk forward, slowly, deliberately, Colby flanking him. After a moment's hesitation, Marrung followed. Yurri watched, her heart in her throat, as the two groups approached each other across the sand. The morning sun glinted off the harbor water behind them. Seabirds wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the tense air. When perhaps 20 feet separated them, both groups stopped. For a long moment, no one moved. The two groups simply stared at each other, taking measure, trying to comprehend what they were seeing. Then Phillip spoke. The sounds meant nothing to Yurri. They were harsh, full of consonants that didn't flow like her language, lacking the musical quality of Eora speech. But his tone was measured, careful, attempting friendliness. Bennelong replied in Eora, his voice carrying the formal cadences of greeting between strangers. I am Bennelong of the Eora people. This is our country, the land of our ancestors since the Dreamtime. We welcome you in peace if you come in peace. We asked your purpose here. Of course, Phillip understood none of this, just as Bennelong understood none of what Phillip had said. The two men stared at each other, the absolute barrier of language yawning between them. Then something remarkable happened. Phillip reached into his coat and withdrew small objects. Yurri couldn't see clearly from her position, but they glinted in the sunlight. He held them out toward Bennelong in his open palm. Gifts. The universal language of peaceful intention. Bennelong stepped forward carefully and accepted the objects. Yurri saw them clearly now as he held them up. They were pieces of glass and metal, shaped into decorative forms, strung on some kind of cord. Beads, though of a type and quality beyond anything her people made. Bennelong studied them for a moment, then reached to his own belt and removed a carved shell ornament, offering it in return. Philip took it with what appeared to be genuine appreciation, examining the intricate patterns carved into the surface. The tension on the beach dropped perceptibly. Men on both sides relaxed slightly, though hands stayed near weapons on both sides. Then Philip did something unexpected. He gestured toward the supplies being unloaded from the boats, then made motions as if eating and drinking. The meaning was clear. He was offering to share food. Yurri saw Bennelong, and Colby exchanged glances. This was a significant gesture in Eora culture as well. Sharing food created obligations, established relationships. It was not something to be entered into lightly. But Bennelong nodded. "We will share food," he said in Eora, even though Philip couldn't understand the words. "We will learn about each other. Perhaps we will understand." What followed was a strange, stilted gathering. The Eora cautiously came onto the beach, the women holding back slightly but present. The British, for that was who they were, though it would be days before Bennelong learned that word, brought out supplies, hard bread that Yurri found nearly inedible, strange preserved meats, and water in containers of worked metal that seemed almost magical in their smoothness. The Eora offered what they had: fish caught that morning, roots and tubers, the small sweet fruits that grew along the shore. The British examined these offerings with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed revulsion. Language was impossible, but gestures worked to some degree. Names were exchanged, though pronunciation was mangled on both sides. Philip pointed to himself and said "Philip" slowly. Bennelong repeated it as "Philip," making the British laugh, and then gave his own name, which Philip rendered as Bennelong. Yurri found herself approached by a British woman, one of the few present, who smiled and gestured at her hair, her possum-skin cloak, asking questions in that incomprehensible tongue. The woman had kind eyes but looked exhausted, her skin red from sun and her clothes stained with salt and sweat. Yurri tried to respond, showing her how the cloak was made, how the skins were sewn together. The woman seemed genuinely interested, touching the fur with gentle fingers. Through it all, Yurri kept glancing toward Marrung, who stayed alert at the perimeter with the other younger men, watching for any sign of treachery. Their eyes met frequently across the strange gathering, silent conversations passing between them. As the sun climbed higher and the morning wore on, Yurri began to notice details that troubled her. The British were already cutting down trees, digging into the earth, changing the land. They did this casually, thoughtlessly, as if the land was simply material to be shaped to their will rather than a living entity that required respect and care. She saw them dump waste into the stream, the same stream that her people drank from, that held sacred significance. She watched them trample through areas that should not be walked upon, blind to the spiritual geography that any Eora child could read. And the numbers. More boats were being rowed to shore, bringing more people, more supplies, more evidence that this was not a brief visit but a permanent installation. Old Marrung had been right. This was change on a scale that would echo through the songlines. These strangers had come to stay, and they understood nothing of the law, of the land, of the delicate balance that the Eora had maintained for countless generations. Yurri felt a hand on her arm and turned to find Marrung beside her. He had left his watching post to come to her, propriety forgotten in his urgency. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Bennelong is right to make peace, but we need to understand what we face. The elders must know everything." She nodded, and together they moved to where Bennelong stood with Philip and several other British officers. The two leaders were attempting communication through increasingly elaborate gestures, and despite the absurdity of it, both seemed genuinely trying to understand each other. Bennelong noticed them approach and nodded slightly. Permission to interrupt. "We should return," Marrung said respectfully. "The women are tired, and there is much to discuss with the elders." Bennelong agreed, and through gestures, he conveyed to Philip that they would be leaving but would return. Philip seemed to understand, nodding and offering more gifts, this time a piece of mirror glass that made several of the Eora gasp in amazement when they saw their own reflections. As they prepared to depart, Yurri took one last look at the scene on the beach. The British were already erecting structures, tents and frameworks that would become more permanent buildings. They worked with tools of metal that cut through wood like a spear through water. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they had every right to be here, to transform this place into something new. Did they not see that this land already belonged to someone? That every tree, every rock, every grain of sand was part of an intricate web of meaning and obligation? Or did they simply not care? The Eora party walked back toward their camp in relative silence, everyone processing what they had seen. Yurri walked beside Marrung now, past caring about the proper distances. She needed his solid presence beside her, needed something familiar and real in a world that suddenly felt uncertain. "What do you think will happen?" she asked him quietly. He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he thought. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "But I think our world just became much larger and much more complicated." He was right. In the span of a single morning, the certain future that Yurri had imagined, marriage to Marrung, children, growing into her role as a keeper of women's knowledge like her grandmother, had become unclear, shrouded in questions that had no answers yet. But as Marrung's hand briefly brushed against hers, a fleeting touch that spoke volumes, Yurri felt a fierce determination rise in her chest. Whatever came, they would face it together. Their love, their law, their connection to this land, these things were real and true and worth fighting for. The strangers had come with their ships and their metal tools and their incomprehensible words. But the songlines had survived ice ages and droughts and countless other challenges. Surely they could survive this too. Couldn't they? Part 3. The Unraveling. The seasons turned, though not in the way Yurri had known them all her life. It had been 8 months since that first encounter on the beach, 8 months that felt like 8 lifetimes. The British settlement, which they called Sydney Cove, after some important man in their distant homeland, had grown from a cluster of tents into a sprawling collection of wooden buildings, gardens, and fortifications. Where once there had been pristine bushland stretching down to the harbor, now there were cleared fields, fenced enclosures, and the constant sound of axes biting into wood. The Eora had tried to maintain their normal patterns of life. They still moved through their traditional territories with the seasons, still performed the ceremonies that connected them to the Dreamtime, still told the stories and walked the songlines. But everything had become harder, more complicated, shadowed by the presence of these strangers who seemed determined to remake the land in their own image. Yurri sat by the water's edge in the early morning light, ostensibly digging for yams in the soft mud but mostly just thinking. She had changed in these months, she knew. The girl who had stood on the cliff that first evening watching the ships approach, innocent, certain of her place in the world, felt like someone from another life entirely. The changes had come gradually, then all at once. At first, there had been a strange equilibrium. The British stayed mostly in their settlement, venturing out cautiously to fish and hunt. Though they were terrible at both, Yurri had noted with some amusement. The Eora continued their own lives, occasionally visiting the settlement to trade or out of curiosity. Bennelong had become something of a bridge between the two worlds, spending increasing amounts of time with the British, learning their language, trying to explain Eora customs and law. "They don't understand ownership the way we do," Bennelong had explained to the gathered clans one night, frustration evident in his voice. "They think because they put up fences and plant crops, the land belongs to them. They don't see how it already belongs to us, how it has always belonged to us through law and dreaming." "Then make them see," old Colby had urged. "Make them understand." But how could you make someone understand something so fundamental, so woven into every aspect of existence, when they didn't even have the concepts in their language to grasp it? The British word, land, meant something dead, inert, a resource to be exploited. The Eora understanding of country was living, breathing, sacred, inseparable from identity itself. The real problems had begun when the British started expanding. They needed more land for crops, they said through Bennelong's halting translation. More timber for building. More game for food, though they were so incompetent at hunting that they often came back empty-handed, leading to increasing tensions as they turned to trading or simply taking what they needed. And they had brought diseases. Yuri's hands stilled in the mud as she thought about this, the horror of it still fresh despite the months that had passed. It had started in the camps to the north, people falling sick with fevers and strange pustules on their skin. Within weeks, entire families were dead. The sickness spread like wildfire through the clans, killing indiscriminately, children, elders, warriors, everyone. The British called it smallpox, and they seemed unsurprised by its appearance, almost resigned to it. Their own people had some kind of immunity, Bennelong reported. They had survived it before, in their homeland. But for the Eora, who had never encountered such a disease, it was devastating. Yuri's own clan had lost 20 people in the first outbreak. 20 souls who had been walking, laughing, living one day and gone the next. Among them was old Marrung. The grief still sat heavy in Yuri's chest. Her grandmother had died as she had lived, with dignity and strength, singing the sacred songs even as the fever consumed her. With her last breath, she had gripped Yuri's hand and whispered, "Remember. Remember everything. The songs must continue." But how could the songs continue when the singers were dying? When the sacred sites were being cleared for British farms? When the very land that the songs described was being transformed beyond recognition? A shadow fell across Yurri, and she looked up to find Marrung standing over her. His face was grim, his body tense in a way that meant trouble. "Bennelong has been taken," he said without preamble. Yuri's stomach dropped. "Taken? By whom?" "By Philip. By the British." Marrung's jaw was tight with anger. They invited him to the settlement, then seized him. They're holding him on one of their ships. This was a violation of everything, a betrayal of the fragile trust that had been built. Yurri scrambled to her feet, her digging stick forgotten. Why? What reason? They want a hostage, Marrung explained as they began walking quickly back toward the camp. Or so we believe. They want someone who can teach them our language, our ways. They think by holding Bennelong, they can force this knowledge from him. The arrogance of it took Yuri's breath away. As if knowledge was something that could be taken by force, rather than given freely between willing hearts. As if Bennelong was a possession to be used rather than a man deserving of respect and autonomy. When they reached the camp, they found it in uproar. Warriors were gathering, faces painted for conflict, weapons being readied. The mood was dark, dangerous, closer to war than Yurri had ever seen her people. Colby stood at the center, his usually jovial face set in hard lines. We should attack, he was arguing to the assembled men. We should burn their settlement, drive them back to their ships, make them leave our country. And how many of us would die? Another voice countered, Pemulwuy, a warrior from a neighboring clan, already known for his fierce resistance to British encroachment. They have weapons we don't understand. Thundersticks that kill from a distance. We have seen what they can do. Then we die fighting, Colby shot back. Better that than to watch our people waste away from their diseases, to see our land stolen piece by piece, to become strangers in our own country. The debate raged, voices rising in anger and fear and grief. Yurri listened, feeling helpless. This was men's business, the business of war and strategy. But the consequences would fall on everyone, women and children included. She felt Marrung's hand briefly touch her back, a gesture of comfort and solidarity. Over these months, as the world had grown more chaotic around them, they had drawn closer. The formal courtship rituals had fallen by the wayside. There had been no time for ceremony when people were dying, when every day brought new crises. But they were together now in all the ways that mattered. They shared a sleeping area, spoke freely of their feelings, made plans for a future that grew more uncertain by the day. They had not yet performed the marriage ceremony, that required the presence of elders who were now dead, required stability and celebration that felt impossible in these troubled times. I'm going to the settlement, Marrung said quietly, for her ears only. We need to see Bennelong, to understand what's happening. Will you come with me? It was dangerous. The British had shown themselves willing to seize people without warning. But Yurri nodded without hesitation. Yes. We face this together. They slipped away from the arguing council, taking a small group with them, mostly younger people, those who had been most active in trading and communicating with the British. The walk to Sydney Cove felt different now, tainted with suspicion and fear where before there had been cautious curiosity. As they approached the settlement, Yurri was struck again by how much it had grown. The British had built a proper town now, with houses of wood and brick, gardens laid out in rigid geometric patterns so unlike the organic flow of the land. There was a building they called Government House, where Philip lived, and another they called the hospital, and long structures that housed their convicts, the strange underclass of their society, people who had been sent here as punishment for crimes in their homeland. The convicts were perhaps the saddest part of the British presence. These people, mostly thin, pale, haunted-looking, had no choice in being here. They were slaves, essentially, forced to labor under harsh conditions. Some had tried to escape into the bush, but they lacked the knowledge to survive. The Eora had found their bodies, dead from exposure or starvation or snake bite, their faces frozen in expressions of terror and confusion. A British guard, a man in a red coat carrying one of those thundersticks they called muskets, challenged them as they approached. He shouted something incomprehensible, raising his weapon. One of their group, a young man named Barangaru who had learned some English, stepped forward. "We come see Benelong," he said haltingly, each word carefully pronounced in that strange tongue. The guard's expression shifted from hostility to something like pity. He lowered his weapon and gestured for them to wait, then disappeared into one of the buildings. They stood in the dusty street, for that's what it was now, a street, not the living earth they had known, and waited. Yurri noticed how the British who passed stared at them with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and something that might have been guilt. Some of the women looked at her with sympathy, but none spoke. Finally, the guard returned with an officer, a thin man with nervous eyes who spoke in rapid, clipped sentences. Barangaru struggled to translate. "He says, Benelong is guest? No prisoner? Learning English. Teaching our talk. Cannot see him. Orders from Phillip. Guest?" Marrung's voice dripped with sarcasm even though he spoke in Eora. "A guest who cannot leave is a prisoner." But there was nothing they could do. The British had superior numbers here, superior weapons. To try to free Benelong by force would mean death for all of them. They were turning to leave when a voice called out from one of the buildings. "Wait! Please wait!" A woman emerged, British but different from the others. She was young, perhaps 30, with kind eyes and hands stained with what looked like plant dyes. She approached them with none of the hesitation shown by other British, speaking directly to Yurri. Of course, Yurri understood nothing. But the woman's tone was gentle, apologetic. She gestured toward the building she'd emerged from, some kind of dwelling, and then mimicked eating and drinking. "She offers food," Barangaru translated. "She says sorry? For Benelong. She wants to help?" It could be a trap. But something in the woman's face seemed genuine. Yurri found herself nodding, and the group followed the woman into her house. Inside, it was strange and claustrophobic. Walls on all sides, a ceiling overhead, no connection to the sky or earth. But the woman, who introduced herself as Mary, through elaborate gestures, seemed genuinely welcoming. She brought out bread and tea, the British beverage that Yurri had learned to tolerate if not enjoy, and through Barangaru's halting translation, tried to explain. Mary was the wife of a Marine, one of the soldiers. But unlike many of the British, she had tried to learn about the Eora, had made friends with some of the women who came to trade. She was horrified by Philip's decision to imprison Benelong, had argued against it with her husband, who had some influence among the Marines. "Many of us not agree," Mary said slowly, giving Barangaru time to translate. "But Philip desperate. Crops failing. People sick. He thinks, understanding you, will help survival. Then he should ask, not take," Yurri found herself saying, even though she knew Mary wouldn't understand the words. Something in her tone must have conveyed the meaning, though, because Mary nodded sadly. Yes. Should ask? I tell him. But he, afraid. Afraid you attack. Afraid we all die here. It was a revelation, the idea that the British were afraid of them. The Eora had spent these months feeling overwhelmed by British technology, British numbers, British diseases. But of course the British had their own fears. They were far from home, in a land they didn't understand, surrounded by people whose intentions they couldn't read. Fear on both sides then. Fear breeding mistrust, mistrust breeding conflict. As they sat in Mary's strange house, drinking bitter tea and struggling to communicate across the chasm of language and culture, Yurri felt a strange kinship with this woman. They were both caught between worlds, both trying to make sense of a situation that seemed designed to prevent understanding. Mary showed them drawings she had made, surprisingly accurate sketches of Eora people, of native plants and animals. She pointed to one of a woman with a baby, then gestured to herself and made a cradling motion. She was pregnant, Yurri realized, bringing new life into this confused, violent world. Your child, Yurri said in Eora, placing a hand on her own belly and then gesturing to Mary, will grow up here. In our country. What will we teach them? Hate? Fear? Or something better? Mary didn't understand the words, but she seemed to grasp the sentiment. Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to clasp Yurri's hand. It was a moment of genuine connection, a glimpse of what might be possible if only there was time. If only both sides could slow down and truly try to understand each other. But time was the one thing they didn't have. That night, back at camp, the council made their decision. They would not attack, not yet. But they would withdraw, pull back from the settlement, stop the trading and visiting that had characterized the past months. The British had broken faith by taking Ben along. Until he was released, there would be no cooperation, no friendship. It was, effectively, a declaration of Cold War. Yurri lay beside Marrung that night, their bodies close under the possum skin cloaks, and felt the weight of all that was being lost. Not just the land, not just the lives taken by disease, but something more intangible. The possibility of coexistence, of mutual respect, of two peoples finding a way to share this country. Do you remember that first night? Marrung whispered into the darkness. When we saw the ships? Yes, Yurri replied. We were so innocent then. We thought the worst that could happen was war. But this... He struggled for words. This slow dissolution, this watching our world come apart piece by piece, it's worse than any battle. Yurri thought of her grandmother's last words. Remember. The songs must continue. We have to believe there's a future, she said, not sure if she was trying to convince Marrung or herself. Even if we can't see what it looks like yet. We have to believe our children will find a way. Our children, Marrung echoed, and his hand found hers in the darkness. You're certain now? She was. She had missed her moonblood cycle twice now, felt the subtle changes in her body that spoke of new life taking root. In the midst of death and destruction, she was creating life. Yes, she said. We're going to have a child. She felt Marrung's sharp intake of breath, felt him turn toward her in the darkness. Then we must marry, he said. Properly. with ceremony. Even if we have to do it ourselves, just us and whatever elders remain. Our child will be born into law, into the songlines. They will know who they are and where they come from. It was defiance in its way. A refusal to let the chaos of the world erase their traditions, their identity. A stubborn insistence that some things were worth preserving no matter what came. Yes, Yurri agreed. We'll marry. We'll raise our child. We'll remember the songs. And if her voice trembled slightly, if doubt crept in around the edges of her determination, she pushed it away. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight she had Marrung beside her, a child growing within her, and the stars overhead, the same stars that had watched over countless generations of her people. The songlines would continue. They had to. Even if the world through which they ran was changing beyond all recognition. Part 4. The Breaking Point. The child came with the turning of the season, when the wattle trees burst into golden bloom, and the air grew thick with the promise of summer storms. Yurri labored through the night, attended by the remaining women of her clan, fewer now than there had been, their numbers decimated by successive waves of smallpox and other diseases the British had brought with them. The birth was hard. Without old Marrung's experienced hands, without the full circle of women who should have been present to sing the sacred songs and perform the rituals, everything felt incomplete, diminished. But when the baby finally emerged into the world with a lusty cry, when Yurri held her daughter against her chest and felt that fierce, immediate love flood through her, nothing else mattered. "She's perfect," Marrung whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he knelt beside them. By rights, he shouldn't have been present at the birth. That was women's business. But so many of the old rules had fallen away in these desperate times. "What will we call her?" Yurri looked down at the tiny face, the dark eyes that seemed to take in everything despite being mere minutes old. "Barangaroo," she said, naming the child after her grandmother's mother, reaching back through the generations to anchor this new life to the long chain of ancestors. "She will carry the old names forward." It was now 14 months since the British arrival, and the fragile equilibrium that had existed in those first weeks had completely shattered. Bennelong had eventually been released after 5 months of captivity, but he had returned changed. He spoke English now, wore British clothes sometimes, had developed relationships with Philip and other officers that the rest of the Eora viewed with suspicion. Some called him a traitor. Others said he was trying to survive, to protect his people by understanding the enemy. Yurri thought perhaps both were true. Bennelong was caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, and the strain showed in his eyes. The British settlement had expanded relentlessly. What had been Sydney Cove now sprawled along the harbour shore and pushed inland, consuming the bushland, driving away the game, fouling the waters. The British called it progress and civilization. The Eora watched their country being torn apart and called it desecration. And the violence had escalated. It had started with small incidents. A British farmer shot at Eora people he found on his land. An Eora warrior speared a British soldier who had been abusing a native woman. But it had grown into something more systematic, more bitter. Pemulwuy, the fierce warrior from the neighboring Bidjigal clan, had become the symbol of resistance. He led raids on British settlements, targeting their crops and livestock, disappearing into the bush before the British could retaliate with their muskets and organized forces. The British had put a price on his head, but no one would betray him. He was fighting for all of them, even those too afraid or exhausted to fight themselves. Marrung had joined some of these raids. Yurri knew this, though he tried to hide it from her, tried to protect her from the knowledge of the risks he took. But she saw the burns on his hands from torches, saw the troubled look in his eyes when he returned from days away, heard the whispered conversations among the men. "You're going to get yourself killed," she told him one evening as baby Barangarus slept between them. They had finally performed a marriage ceremony, a small, hurried affair with what few elders remained. It hadn't been the joyous celebration they'd once imagined, but it had been real, binding them together in the eyes of law and community. "And if I do nothing?" Marrung replied, his voice raw. "If I just watch as they take everything? What kind of father would that make me? What kind of man?" "A living one," Yurri shot back. "An alive one who can teach his daughter the songs, who can pass on the knowledge. Dead men teach nothing." But she knew it wasn't that simple. Every Eora man felt the same burning rage, the same desperate need to do something, anything, to stop the tide of destruction. The British seemed unstoppable. For every crop the warriors burned, they planted 2 more. For every building destroyed, they erected 3. They kept coming in their ships, wave after wave of convicts and soldiers and free settlers, all hungry for land that wasn't theirs to take. The breaking point came on a sweltering day in December 1790, when the violence that had been simmering finally boiled over into outright war. Yurri was at the fishing grounds with other women, Barangarus strapped to her back in the traditional carrier, when she heard the screams. They came from the direction of the nearest British farm, a place that had once been prime hunting ground for her people, now fenced and planted with foreign crops. "Stay here," one of the older women commanded, but Yurri was already moving, drawn by a terrible certainty that Marrung was involved. She found chaos. A British farmhouse was burning, thick black smoke billowing into the clear sky. British soldiers were running in all directions, some firing their muskets wildly into the bush. And there, at the edge of the clearing, she saw Marrung and a group of other warriors retreating into the trees. But something was wrong. Marrung was stumbling, one hand pressed to his side, and even from a distance, Yurri could see the dark stains spreading across his skin. Blood. She ran without thinking, baby Barangaroo bouncing against her back, her voice tearing from her throat in a cry of anguish. "Marrung!" He turned at her voice, his face pale beneath its traditional paint, and she saw the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her, for their daughter, for what would happen if the British caught them. "Run!" he shouted, but his voice was weak, breathless. "Yurri, take Barangaroo and run!" A musket cracked, and a chunk of bark exploded from a tree beside her head. The British had seen her, were aiming at her. She zigged sideways, hard hammering, reached Marrung just as he collapsed. The other warriors grabbed him, grabbed her, and together they fled deeper into the bush. The British gave chase for a while, but they were clumsy in the forest, loud and slow. The Eora knew every path, every hiding place. Within minutes they had lost their pursuers. But Marrung was dying. They laid him down in a hidden gully where a small stream ran clear and cold. The musket ball had caught him in the side, just below his ribs. Blood pulsed from the wound with each heartbeat, soaking into the earth. "No!" Yurri whispered, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. No, no, no. Barangaroo began to cry, sensing her mother's distress, and the sound cut through Yurri like a blade. This was the world her daughter was born into, violence and death, and the steady erosion of everything their people had built over countless generations. Marrung's hand found hers, weak but determined. Listen to me, he gasped. You have to promise me. Don't, Yurri sobbed. Don't say goodbye. You're going to be fine. We'll get you to the healers. Promise me, he insisted, his grip tightening with what little strength remained. Barangaroo. Teach her everything. The songs, the stories, the law. Even if the world changes so much we can't recognize it, she has to know who she is. Where she comes from. I promise, Yurri choked out. But you'll be there. You'll teach her too. You have to. I love you, Marrung said, and his eyes were so clear, so focused on her face, as if he was trying to memorize every detail. From that first day on the cliff, I've loved you. You and Barangaroo, you're everything. I love you too, Yurri whispered, leaning down to press her forehead against his. Please don't leave me. Please. But even as she spoke, she felt the change. The tension went out of his body, the light in his eyes dimmed. His hand, which had been gripping hers so tightly, went slack. Marrung was gone. The wail that tore from Yurri's throat was primal, ancient, the sound of every woman who had ever lost a beloved to violence and senselessness. The other warriors stood back, giving her space for her grief, their own faces carved in stone but their eyes wet with tears. Her husband was dead. The father of her child. The man who had stood beside her as their world crumbled, who had tried so hard to protect what remained of their way of life. Dead because he had dared to resist the theft of his country. Dead because he had fought for his people's right to exist on the land that had been theirs since time immemorial. Barangaroo's cries reached a crescendo, and Yurri forced herself to function through the fog of grief. She lifted the baby from the carrier, held her close, let the child's warm weight anchor her to reality. Your father was a brave man, she whispered to Barangaroo, though the infant couldn't understand. A good man. A warrior who fought for what was right. But what good had it done? What had Marrung's death accomplished except to add one more name to the growing list of casualties in this undeclared war? They carried his body back to the camp, moving through the bush like ghosts. By the time they arrived, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, beautiful and terrible, as if the world itself was mourning. The camp received the news with a grief that had become all too familiar. Another death. Another loss. Another piece of their world torn away. Bennelong came to Yurri as she sat beside Marrung's wrapped body, preparing it for the burial rites. He looked older than his years, worn down by the impossible position he occupied between two worlds. I'm sorry, he said simply. Marrung was a good man. A brave warrior. Yurri looked up at him, and all the rage and grief and hopelessness inside her found a target. Are you? She asked, her voice sharp as a stone blade. Are you really sorry? Or are you too busy being friends with the people who killed him? Bennelong flinched as if she had struck him. You think I wanted this? Any of this? I'm trying to find a way for us to survive. By becoming like them? Yurri stood, Barangara clutched against her chest. By forgetting who we are. Our people are dying, Benelong. From their diseases, from their guns, from their theft of our land. And you sit in government house drinking their tea and learning their language and pretending there's some peaceful way forward. What would you have me do? Benelong's voice rose, anguished. Lead a war we cannot win? The British have ships that can bring 1,000 more soldiers. They have weapons we cannot match. They have diseases we cannot fight. I am trying to save what can be saved. There is nothing to save if we lose ourselves in the process. They stared at each other across Marrung's body, two people who had once been allies, now divided by different visions of survival. Benelong looked like he wanted to say more, but finally he just shook his head and walked away. Yurri sank back down, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had come. What was the point? Benelong was doing what he thought was right, just as Marrung had done what he thought was right. And both approaches led to the same place: loss, grief, the slow dissolution of everything their people had been. That night, they performed the burial rites for Marrung. What few elders remained sang the death songs, helping to guide his spirit on its journey to the dreaming. They buried him in the traditional way, in a place of significance, with his weapons and personal items. Yurri sang too, her voice cracking with grief but still carrying the ancient words. These songs had been sung for thousands of years, for countless dead. They connected Marrung to all those who had gone before, welcomed him into the eternal company of ancestors. But as she sang, Yurri couldn't help but wonder, would there be anyone left to sing these songs in another generation? Would Barangaru grow up knowing the old ways, or would she become something new, something hybrid, caught between the dying Eora world and the rising British one? After the ceremony, after everyone else had drifted away to their own grief and exhaustion, Yurri sat alone with Barangaru under the stars. The same stars that had watched over her people forever, indifferent to the suffering below. Your father made me promise, she told the sleeping baby, to teach you everything. The songs, the stories, the law. And I will keep that promise. No matter what comes, you will know who you are. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in. How could she teach the old ways when the land itself was being transformed? How could she pass on knowledge of sacred sites when those sites were being destroyed? How could she sing the songlines when the very landscape they described no longer existed? Still, she had to try. It was all she had left, this child, these memories, these songs. They were Marrung's legacy, and her grandmother's, and all the generations stretching back to the Dreamtime. The British thought they had conquered this land. They thought their guns and their ships and their civilization had won. But they didn't understand that a people could not be erased as long as someone remembered. As long as the songs continued. Yurri held Barangara close and began to sing, softly, almost a whisper, the lullaby her own mother had sung to her. It was a song about the land, about belonging, about the eternal connection between people and country. It was a song of resistance. And as long as she had breath in her body, she would keep singing it. Part 5. What Remains. 10 years passed like water through fingers. Too fast, leaving Yurri grasping at moments that slipped away before she could fully hold them. It was 1800 now, by the British reckoning, and the world had changed so completely that sometimes Yurri felt like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life. The Sydney settlement had exploded into a proper town, with streets and markets and thousands of British inhabitants. More settlements had sprung up along the harbour and rivers, Parramatta, Toongabbie, places that bore corrupted versions of Eora names but had been utterly transformed from what they once were. The Eora people had not disappeared, but they had been reduced, fractured, scattered. The great clans that had once numbered in the hundreds now counted their survivors in dozens. Disease had been the cruelest killer. Smallpox had returned twice more, each outbreak claiming more lives. But there had been other causes of death too: violence, starvation as traditional food sources vanished, despair. Yurri was 30 years old now, though she felt ancient. The girl who had stood on the cliff watching the first ships arrive felt like someone from a story, not someone she had actually been. That girl had believed in certainties, in the permanence of her world. This woman knew better. But she had kept her promise to Marrung. "Tell me again about the dreaming," Barangaroo said, and Yurri looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Barangaroo was 10 years old, balanced on the cusp between childhood and womanhood. She had her father's eyes and her mother's determined chin, and she moved through the world with a confidence that sometimes frightened Yurri. She was a child of two worlds, fluent in both Eora and English, comfortable in the bush and in the British town, belonging fully to neither. They sat on the same cliffs where Yurri and Marrung had first seen the ships, though the view was different now. British buildings crowded the harbour shores, ships came and went constantly, and the pristine wilderness had been replaced by farms and roads and the marks of British possession. "The dreaming is the time before time," Yurri began, speaking in Eora though she knew Barangaroo understood English better these days. "When the ancestor spirits walked the earth and created everything, the land, the animals, the plants, the people. They sang the world into being, and their songs became the songlines, the paths we follow to understand our place in creation." She had told this story hundreds of times over the past 10 years, drilling it into Barangaroo along with all the other knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The names of plants and their uses. The sacred sites and their significance. The kinship relationships that connected their family to the wider web of Eora society, or what remained of it. "But Mama," Barangaroo said, and Yurri heard the uncertainty in her voice. "Mrs. Johnson at the mission school says those are just stories. She says there's only one God, and He made everything in 6 days and—" "Mrs. Johnson doesn't know everything," Yurri interrupted, trying to keep the sharpness from her voice. The mission school was another complication in their lives. Reverend Johnson and his wife had established it 5 years ago, offering to teach native children to read and write English, to learn British ways. Yurri had resisted at first, but Bennelong had convinced her. "The British aren't leaving," he had said, and his eyes had held a weary resignation. "Our children need to understand their world if they're going to survive in it. Let Barangaroo learn their language, their skills. She can still be Eora. She can be both." So Barangaroo went to the mission school, and she learned to read from British books and write with British pens and prayed to the British God. And Yurri watched her daughter slip further away, becoming something new, something that hadn't existed before. "Both things can be true," Yurri said now, choosing her words carefully. "The British have their stories about how the world began, and we have ours. What matters is that you know your people's stories, your father's stories. They're part of who you are. Berengar nodded, but Yurri could see the confusion in her eyes. How could a child reconcile such different worldviews? How could anyone? Tell me about Papa, Berengar said, as she did often. She had no memory of Marrung. She had been just 4 months old when he died, but Yurri had made sure she knew him through stories. Your father was the bravest man I ever knew, Yurri began, and felt the familiar ache in her chest. 10 years, and the grief was still there, dulled but never gone. He was a skilled hunter, a fierce warrior, and he loved you more than life itself. He died fighting to protect our country, our way of life. But he failed, Berengar said matter-of-factly, with the brutal honesty of children. The British are still here. They won. Yurri wanted to argue, to say that survival itself was a kind of victory, that as long as even one person remembered the old ways, the British hadn't truly won. But looking at the transformed landscape around them, at the British town that had swallowed the place where generations of her people had lived and died, it was hard to make that argument convincing. He tried, Yurri said finally. Sometimes that's all we can do. Try and hope it matters. They sat in silence for a while, watching the harbor traffic, British ships and boats, moving about their business, oblivious to the fact that this water had once been pure, had once teemed with fish, had once been navigated by bark canoes rather than wooden vessels. They sat in silence for a while, watching the harbor traffic, British ships and boats, moving about their business, oblivious to the fact that this water had once been pure, had once teemed with fish, had once been navigated by bark canoes rather than wooden vessels. Mama, Berengar said hesitantly, Mary, Mrs. Johnson's daughter, asked me to come to her birthday celebration next week. There will be cake and games and... She trailed off, watching Yuri's face anxiously. This was the constant negotiation of their lives now. How much to engage with the British world, how much to hold back. If Yurri said no, she would be protecting Berengar from further assimilation, but also isolating her, making her an outsider in the world she would have to navigate. If she said yes, she would be letting her daughter slip further into that other world, becoming more British and less Eora with each passing day. You can go, Yurri said, and saw relief and guilt war in Berengar's expression. But first, you'll help me perform the women's ceremony at the sacred pool. You need to stay connected to your people, to your law. The sacred pool was one of the few sites that remained relatively untouched, a spring-fed pool in a rocky gully that the British hadn't yet found use for. It was where Yuri's grandmother had taught her the sacred women's business, where generations of Eora women had performed the rituals that connected them to the land and to each other. Fewer women came now. So many were dead, and those who survived were scattered, struggling just to stay alive. But Yurri came faithfully, bringing Berengar when she could, keeping the traditions alive even if only barely. They made their way down from the cliffs and through the bush toward the sacred pool. This land at least still felt somewhat familiar. The British hadn't cleared this area yet, though Yurri knew it was only a matter of time. She had learned to recognize the signs, surveyors tramping through with their strange instruments, making marks on trees, drawing lines on maps as if the land was blank space to be divided and distributed. As they walked, Yurri pointed out plants and their uses, just as her grandmother had done for her. This is Galilean. You can eat the roots, but you have to prepare them carefully or they'll make you sick. And this is Berwin. We use the bark for making cord. Your great-great-grandmother's generation discovered that if you soak it in water first. Mama, I know, Berengar said, with the exasperation of a child who had heard the same lessons repeatedly. You've told me 100 times. Then I'll tell you 100 more, Yurri replied firmly. Because when I'm gone, you'll be the one who needs to remember. You'll be the one to teach your own children if you have them. If. So much uncertainty in that word. Would Berengar marry? Would she choose an Eora man, and there were so few young men left, or a British man, as some native women had done? Would she have children, and if so, what would they be? How many generations before the Eora blood was so diluted that nothing remained? They reached the sacred pool, and Yurri felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Here, at least, things were as they should be. The water still ran clear, the rock formations still held their ancient shapes, the spirits of the place still whispered in the rustling leaves. She taught Berengar the songs, the movements, the proper way to approach the sacred water. They performed the cleansing ritual together, and for those moments, Yurri could almost believe that nothing had changed, that they were just one more generation in an unbroken chain stretching back to the Dreamtime. But the illusion couldn't last. As they finished the ceremony and prepared to leave, they heard voices, British voices, loud and careless, crashing through the bush. 3 British men emerged into the clearing, surveyors by the look of their equipment. They stopped when they saw Yurri and Berengar, surprise evident on their faces. Well, well, one of them said, and Yurri recognized the tone even if she didn't catch all the words. Condescension, amusement, the casual contempt that many British showed toward her people. What have we here? A couple of native women at there. What is this, some kind of bathing spot? Berengar stepped forward before Yurri could stop her, speaking in perfect English. This is the sacred site of the Eora people. You shouldn't be here. The men laughed. Sacred site? It's just a pool, love. And it's crown land now, like everything else. We're here to survey it for development. Going to be a nice little reservoir, provide water for the growing town. Yurri felt the words like physical blows. They were going to destroy the sacred pool. Turn it into a British water source, strip it of all meaning and significance, reduce it to mere utility. You can't, she said in Eora, knowing they wouldn't understand but unable to stop herself. This place has been sacred for thousands of years. Our ancestors. Mama, Berengar said quietly, switching back to Eora. They don't care. They can't understand. And that was the truth of it, brutal and simple. These men looked at the pool and saw only water. They looked at the land and saw only resources. They looked at Yurri and Berengar and saw obstacles to progress, remnants of a past that needed to be swept aside. One of the surveyors pulled out a flask and took a drink, then tossed the empty container into the sacred pool. The casual desecration made Yuri's blood boil, but what could she do? Fight them? There were 3 of them and 2 of her. Call for help? From whom? The nearest Eora camp was miles away, and they were as powerless as she was. Come on, Berengar said, tugging at her mother's arm. Let's go. There's nothing we can do. The resignation in her daughter's voice, a child of 10, already knowing the limits of her power, broke something in Yurri's heart. This was what she had raised Berengar to accept, that their sacred places would be destroyed, that their protests would be ignored, that survival meant swallowing grief and rage and carrying on anyway. They walked away from the sacred pool, and Yurri didn't look back. As they approached the settlement, they saw a commotion near Government House. A crowd had gathered, British and native alike, and Yurri felt a chill of premonition. "What's happening?" Berengar asked, but Yurri was already moving toward the crowd, pushing through to see. In the center of the gathering, bound in chains, was Pemulwuy. The warrior who had fought the longest, the hardest, who had become a legend among both the Eora and the British, had finally been captured. He stood straight despite the chains, his face defiant, and even battered and imprisoned, he radiated a fierce dignity. Governor King, Philip's successor, stood on the steps of Government House, reading from a document in his pompous voice. Yurri caught enough words to understand. Pemulwuy was being charged with various crimes against the colony, and he would be hanged. Executed. Killed by British law for the crime of defending his own country. Yurri felt Berengar's hand slip into hers, and she squeezed it tight. Around them, she could see other Eora faces in the crowd. Bennelong was there, his expression anguished. Colby stood nearby, his hands clenched into fists, tears streaming down his face. This was the end of something. Not just Pemulwuy's life, but the last real resistance. With him gone, who would fight? Who had the strength, the courage, the sheer stubborn refusal to accept British domination? But then Pemulwuy's eyes found the Eora faces in the crowd, and he began to sing. It was a death song, ancient and powerful, the kind of song that warriors sang when they knew they were going to die but refused to go quietly. His voice rang out over the crowd, and one by one, other Eora voices joined in, hesitantly at first, then with growing strength. Yurri found herself singing too, the words coming from some deep place beyond conscious thought. Berengar looked up at her in surprise, then back at Pemulwuy, and slowly, tentatively, she began to sing as well. The British tried to shout them down, but the song continued. It spoke of the land, of belonging, of resistance that would outlast any chains or gallows. It spoke of a people who had been here for 40,000 years and would not be erased, no matter what the invaders did. The British could kill Pemulwuy. They could destroy the sacred sites, steal the land, spread their diseases and their civilization. But they could not silence the songs. Not as long as someone remembered. As Yurri sang with her daughter beside her, with the voices of her people rising around her, she understood something she hadn't before. Marrung's death hadn't been meaningless. The sacred pool being destroyed wasn't meaningless. Even Pemulwuy's impending execution wasn't meaningless. They were all part of a larger story, a longer arc. The British thought they had won because they had the songlines would continue. That night, after Pemulwuy had been taken away to await his execution, after the crowd had dispersed, Yurri sat with Berengar in their small hut and held her daughter close. "Tell me about the dreaming," Berengar said again, and this time, there was no uncertainty in her voice. So Yurri told the stories, all of them, the whole long tapestry of myth and memory and meaning. She told them in Eora, and Berengar listened, and the words hung in the air between them like a bridge connecting past to present to future. Outside, the British town buzzed with its alien life. But inside this small hut, 2 Eora women kept the old knowledge alive, passing it from one generation to the next, ensuring that something essential and true and worth preserving, would survive the cataclysm. Somewhere, Yurri believed, Marrung's spirit watched over them. Somewhere, her grandmother's spirit smiled. Somewhere, all the ancestors who had walked these songlines since the Dreamtime looked on and knew that the chain remained unbroken. The world had changed beyond recognition. Everything Yurri had known and loved had been taken, transformed, or destroyed. But the songs remained. And as long as the songs remained, her people remained. That would have to be enough.